welcome to everyone who continue to join us. Welcome to this Just Energy for All webinar. And today we'll be discussing more about Global South and gender perspectives on COP27. As you know, this is part of our Just Energy for All webinar series that addresses our climate justice priorities. If we can go to the next slide, please. And two more. So my name is Ilka Vega, and I'm the Executive for Economic and Environmental Justice with United Women in Faith. And today I'm joining you from Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. And the original inhabitants of this land is the oasis of the Western Desert amassing and Egyptians. And so very excited to be joining us for all this part of the world. Very excited to be here for the United Climate Change Conference, or COP27, as we know it. And now I want to know who are joining us right now. And I'll be helping you, Keisha, dress up some of the folks on the ground, perhaps, while I'm also launching this poll to hear if you're a United Women in Faith member. And let's see. Wait. You can answer the poll that is coming up on your screen. Let me know if you're not seeing that. But if you can see it, perhaps if it might not be coming up, it might be under the poll section on the bottom of your screen. I want to know if you're a United Women in Faith, and if what's your United Women in Faith jurisdiction, if this is your first United Women in Faith Just Energy for All training or webinar, and if you have heard about COP27 on the news. And if this is not showing up on your screen, feel free to share that on the chat box as well.
It says it's showing the poll results.
Yeah, let me see if we can do that. Relaunch. Okay, are folks seeing it now?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you.
That's it.
Wonderful. And in the meantime, while folks keep answering our questions, we'd also go ahead and remind ourselves to introduce each other on the chat. So if we go to the next slide, please. We'll be writing again what our name says, where you're joining us from, our pronouns, and what the original indigenous peoples of the land where you live are. And if you don't know this, you can find it at native-land.ca. There you can find a map, an interactive map, and you can put your location, and that will tell you the list of all the indigenous inhabitants of that land. And also include, please, your United Women in Faith affiliation. And then also, for those that have been saying that you've been hearing about COP27 on the news, what are you hearing about COP27? We're interested to know. What are the conversation that you're hearing back at home? Does that give you hope? Does that give you some concern? What are some areas that you would want to reflect more on? So please feel free to continue including those on the chat as we continue throughout the rest of the session. And thank you all for joining us. Do we have anyone who, yeah, we have a few, 13 participants that this is their first Just Energy for All webinar. So welcome, thank you for joining us. Very excited to have you. And if you want to continue joining us, this will be the last session of the series for this year, but we're hoping to continue next year in January. So feel free to join our newsletter and receive some more updates for Just Energy for All webinar series and working groups as well. So I'll leave the poll open a little bit longer, and I'll go ahead and move us to our next part of the program, and Sisterhood of Grace, just to remind us to listen actively with our heads and hearts, to speak from on experience, be very much aware of our body language, respect the confidentiality of the things that are shared within this space, own our own intentions and our impact, practice sustainability, and expect from these conversations unfinished business of both discomfort and joy as we're embarking in this work of learning and unlearning. And so thank you all for following our Sisterhood of Grace principles. And next, we will have dear Sister Joanne member of the Racial Justice Support Team and former Vice President and President of the California Nevada Conference, open us in prayer. Thank you, Joanne.
Thank you, Ika. Let us pray. Spirit of God, we have heard your call as women of faith to share in the caring of your world and building up of your kingdom. Fill us, O Lord, with a desire to change ourselves, our families, our friends, our neighbors, and to change the world. Set us on fire for justice, Lord. Please guide us so that we become committed to change and to transforming unjust situations, unjust systems, and structures. Help us to be more proactive in the healing of what is broken, and Lord, to transform ourselves, our lives, to lives of love that defy injustice around us. Guide us to learn and then implement practices that help heal our polluted waterways, our carbon-heavy skies, our historical and current social, political, and economic injustice. Move us to deepen our concern, Lord, for our sisters and brothers here in America and around the world who are enduring the burdens of poverty, war, exploitation, and persecution. May we envision and then create a different sort of world in which injustice is replaced with a renewed sense of solidarity and care. And then, Lord, equipped by the Spirit, may we go forth in the peace of the Holy Spirit to love and to serve. In the name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
And calling us for transformation and solidarity. If we can go through the rest of the agenda items real quick, we'll be just going a little overview of our plan today. And so I'll do a little bit of our introduction and the spiritual grounding, an introduction to COP27.
Check your volume. We can't hear you now.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'll do an overview of our spiritual grounding, an introduction to COP27, and then we'll have our amazing speakers, Ms. Frances Namomo from the Pacific Conference of Churches. Ms. Frances, please correct me if I mispronounced it. We'll have Tina for Economic and Ecological Justice from the World Council of Churches. And we'll finish up with questions and answers at the end. So please hold on for those first speakers at the end, and we'll have some actions as well to take home and next steps.
We cannot hear you.
Okay, let me see if I can get a little bit closer or perhaps change my microphone. Is this a little bit better?
Okay, I'll fine. I had to turn my speakers up, but I can hear you fine.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
We can hear you fine.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, and I will remind everyone else to please mute. I will put it in the chat so we can hear better.
Thank you. And if we can go to the next slide, that would be great. And so right now, I just want to remind us kind of the work of what are we doing, the work that we're doing in our Just Energy for All campaign and all through our priorities of the Economic and Environmental Justice Office, concentrating on
United Women thing.
And so some of our social principles, and a reminder that the climate action and advocacy that we do is grounded in our biblical responsibilities of creation, and also our Methodist calling to do no harm, do good, and love God. As I said, over social principles. And so if we can go to the next slide, Resolution 160 on the natural world, specifically the section on global climate stewardship, calls us for it explains that the rampant industrialization and the corresponding increase and use of fossil fuels are very much the consequence of the pollutants in the Earth's atmosphere. And so these greenhouse gas emissions dramatically deteriorate and alter the Earth's climate for generations to come, with very severe environmental and economic and social implications. And so these very adverse impacts of global climate change, unfortunately, tend to disproportionately affect individuals and nations also that are the least responsible for these emissions. And so very much so, it's an issue of justice. And so we have to support the governments to require mandatory reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and call for individuals, for congregations like the ones that we're part of, for businesses, for industries, and to other countries as well, and communities at large to reduce our emissions. And so it's very much in our social principles and institutionalized in our agencies as United Methodist Church agencies and United Women in Faith following the social principles as well. And so this is part of the reason why we're here at COP, kind of following on that mandate and listening here and providing witness as well as to what can we do back home, and the work that you all have been doing have been very much relevant to some of the climate negotiations. And so I'm going to explain next a little bit about what COP27 is. So the COP27, the COP part stands for Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so it's basically the annual climate summit for the world. And since 1994, countries have come together to address the impact of climate change. And you might have heard from this, the Paris Agreement that was established at COP21 in Paris. And so this is the space for those negotiations. But it's also the space for informal consultations for countries and stakeholders from civil society, from the private sector, and different constituencies at large to learn from each other and challenge each other to hopefully increase collective action for the climate crisis. And so this time, the COP presidency is in Egypt this year. So if you have heard, I don't know if you have heard comments of other people participating on the news, but it's a very large space. And then thousands of people from all over the world are here. And there's different areas. There's plenary halls, rooms, and there's pavilion exhibitions and organizations in the blue zone that is the accredited area. And also that's where the negotiations happen. And so they're doing some of the work. It's focused on emissions reduction, mitigation, adaptation, climate finance. And this year we have loss and damage as an official item agenda. So we're very excited about that. And there's also side events for presentations. There's Climate Justice Action Hub for the first year. So the participation of civil society, while with different challenges, have seen a few other spaces that have been new from previous years. We also have Indigenous Peoples Hub conversations, from 5 years. And so we have really been focusing, on issues such as the just transition, financing for loss and damage, and one of the biggest focuses from civil society and faith communities having particularly this topic of loss and damage. And so we have had very strong advocates that also throughout the years have continued to center human rights, and especially those who are most vulnerable and most at risk of the climate crisis and climate-related disasters. And so this COP in particular, it says it's all about implementation and how countries are going to say what they're going to do, what they actually are saying and proposing, and finding also more support to increase ambition for targets and our contributions, because right now the current ambitions don't even get us to our 1.5 goal. And so it's still under the Paris Agreement. So it's still very relevant that we're taking this space to increase ambition and most importantly to bring those implementation plans home. And so we're here to bring the perspectives of women of faith and center marginalized voices and those most impacted and issues of justice, really bringing that lens of justice into the conversation, such as the funding for loss and damage, and increased participation of women in Global South communities. And particularly excited here to share with you about some of the insights that are happening at COP27, because Monday was Gender Day, and it was shared actually that one of the most effective ways to tackle the climate crisis, kind of like your return on investment. One of the things that will give you the most return if you invest in this thing is actually investing in women leadership and women's education. And so talking to all of you about this is exciting because United Women in Faith members, through our Just Energy for All campaign, are doing this work locally. You're having those conversations, you're doing those work, you're calling your legislators. And that's exactly the type of work that we need to tackle the climate crisis. And so this conversation that is happening all around the world is very much related to the work that you're doing home. And so it's very important to bring that about and continue to strengthen our capacity and continue engaging with decision makers as we've been doing, and challenging each other to continue doing so more effectively. And so we recognize that we do not live in silos, and that we're consumers and also members of governments, and that our actions matter, and they have consequences also in other parts of the world, including the global south, where countries, as we mentioned, that have contributed the least to emissions in the atmosphere are unfortunately suffering the most for climate disasters and have disproportionate vulnerability. And so it's very important to maintain this justice-centered conversation. And so with that, I want to continue to inspire us and tell us a little bit more of the urgency of incorporating global south and gender perspectives into the climate negotiations and implementation, as well as the imperative of bringing loss and damage language. I would like to now invite our first speaker, Ms. Frances Namomo, and she's the ecumenical coordinator for the Ecological Stewardship and Climate Justice Program from the Pacific Conference of Churches. She's an Itauke, an indigenous woman, a Methodist, and an activist. And her present work, focuses on the role and accompaniment of churches and provide communities faced with the dilemma of climate-induced migration, which is actually a very important topic right now in the negotiations, and as we see, is having increased attention and concern here at COP as well. And so very appreciative to have you with us today, Ms. Frances.
Thank you very much. Bulavinaka, everyone. I hope you can all hear me clearly. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Frances, as has been mentioned, and I'm very much would like to acknowledge the invitation to be part of this great space of women of faith, but more so knowing that there's solidarity between the global south and global north women towards this global crisis of climate change. Please allow me to share my presentation. I've titled my presentation as Weaving Her Story. I guess it's the work that we have been doing since I joined the Pacific Conference of Churches, but more so working with women in the communities, different communities, and being able to bridge the gap between those in the front line or communities, women communities who are in the front line of this global crisis, and being able to influence spaces through the church. So the title of this presentation is really Weaving Her Story. Weaving is a very common, I guess, a common work or task that women in the Pacific are often seen doing when you go to communities here in the region, whether it's weaving a basket, weaving a hat, weaving a mat. And weaving is probably symbolic because it brings together different strands of the mat, different strands of a basket that represent someone's story, whether she's a woman in the community or a woman at the leadership level, trying to make decision in a very a structured patriarchal hierarchy, structured society. So how do my presentation, okay. My presentation is structured into 3 different contexts. I've put our work at the first part of this presentation is really to put into perspective the work that the Pacific Conference of Churches does and why we do the work that we do. And then I'll pull in a bit, draw in at least a little bit more on the loss and damage, why this issue is really important for the region. And of course, the gender-informed solution, why it's important to engage women in this conversation. As you can see on the map, the Pacific Conference of Churches works with 33 member churches, 32 member churches around the Pacific region, 32 member churches and 10 National Council of Churches. And most of these churches are in almost 18 Pacific Island countries. So we're pretty much, work towards the Northern Pacific with the Federated State of Micronesia, or the Republic of the Marshall Islands, to the east with French Polynesia, down south in New Zealand, and of course, the west, taking into account Papua New Guinea and Tana Papua, West Papua. So in a region where almost 90% of people are Christian, it is important to engage the churches. There was an article that written by a professor 5 years ago, stating that development projects that are implemented in the Pacific, when it lacks the faith or the spiritual context, it's not sustainable. Therefore, I guess it's important the role that the church plays or faith communities play when it comes to engaging or when it comes to implementing and influencing spaces on climate, or the work that we do on climate change. We've often talked about, in our general work, we've often talked about the 3 Ps. One is being prophetic. The main one is being prophetic. I guess this is probably common to a lot of our faith communities or the churches, the prophetic role the church play, not only in advocating at national, local, regional, or global platforms, and in this case, being present at the COP meetings, being present at other conferences where negotiations of people's survival, where negotiations about carbon emission, climate financing, adaptation and mitigation, processes are being talked about. When it affects our communities, when it affects the people that we serve, it is therefore important that we are at the table as well. I guess the unique role here in the region, in the Pacific, where the church plays that prophetic role, is because we get invited to both. We are often seen as civil society. We're able to work with civil society organizations, but there are unique spaces where only the churches get invited to in the political or in the government space, even if it's only to go and offer the prayer, to begin the conference or to begin the meeting, or devotion. And if that's an opportunity to influence the messaging, or to bring into the room or into the conference, into that space, the context that we or the context of climate justice, then we would take up that opportunity. So I guess in the Pacific, that's probably a unique space that we are often fluid, being able to be accepted or work well in the civil society, but at the same time, spaces where it's limited for civil society, the church is invited to offer a prayer and devotion. And this is often the space where we get to talk about or influence our message speaking truth to power and being able to influence political will. I guess what's also unique in the Pacific is it's a, as a small island developing states, we know almost everybody. Yeah? We know we meet with our negotiators, we meet with our political leaders, in conferences, we meet with civil society organization or partners from other stakeholder organizations, and we're often meet in different spaces. But then when we do end up at the COP, we're seen as one. We're seen as specific representatives. So we're able to at least move around this space and being able to connect with our political leaders and influence their space, their positions as well. I guess one of the key things that we've been sharing, and it's important for us over the years, is showing up to tell our truth, tell our story. If we're not present physically, we will show up virtually. I guess COVID has taught us to maximize the virtual platform. That's probably why I woke up at 2 a.m. this morning thinking that I had missed this particular webinar, only to find out that it was 4 hours later. So I'm pretty very thankful for the opportunity to be invited in this space to share what the work that we do, but more so how we're engaging with communities around this topic of climate justice. And because the church is often seen in the Pacific as very influential, church leaders are often regarded, in a high level. It is therefore a space to influence, using the pulpit to advocate on this issue. The second P really reflects on the pastoral support or pastoral care that is offered to our communities and our leaders. We work both ways. When I mentioned earlier that we are fluid, we're able to guide, and offer advice when needed to our leaders, but at the same time, we're working or walking with our communities to show support, but at the same time find ways to support them in the face of the impacts of climate change. So accompaniment is the biggest part of our work. It is important, at least in this, in the midst of this global crisis, on top of COVID and everything else, a lot of our communities go through psychosocial trauma. And in the Pacific, this particular word trauma, psychosocial, it's not in our dictionary. We do not talk about it. It's not, an everyday thing that, you can just go up to a counselor, you can make an appointment with a counselor and talk about your issue. I guess it's not clear in our culture. It's not really an object out there that can tell us, look, it's okay to go and talk about your issue. So that's why it's important for the church to accompany communities. And we allow the accompaniment process to have the community's voices, different voices. A lot of our communities, I must say, in the region are still very, very, most of our culture, most of the society, patriarchal, very hierarchy structured. Therefore, the accompaniment of churches being with the communities is allowing space also for other groups to be able to have their voices heard. Women, persons living with disabilities, children, young people, the elderlies. What do they say? How do they respond? What would they want when it comes to finding solutions to the impacts, losses, and damage when it comes to climate change? And of course, this accompaniment is also being able to link the context, the stories from the communities to what's happening at COP. Over the years, we've always wanted to have our representative at COPs, but over the years, we've also learned while we have our representative at COP, we must also have a parallel side event here in the Pacific, at least with the community, so they understand what's happening at COP affects them, but at the same time, the stories, the solutions, the success stories from the communities, the challenges are able to influence our negotiators when they do go to the COP meetings or other important conferences that influence the impact or the negotiation of this issue on climate change. And of course, being practical. We talk about, at least some of the current work that we're doing is trying to identify or trying to, while we're in the front line of this global crisis, we're trying as much as possible to do our part as well. For the longest time, we can point to the global north and say, look, cut down on your fossil fuel, talk to your government and do this. But at the same time, we need to look, we've also learned to look within and see where our strength can come from. How can we build our own communities while we are also advocating at that level? So, working on our, food security initiatives, trying to come up with sustainable food practices, food management, agriculture practices, sustainable agricultural practices, or at least the traditional way of traditional conservation, traditional preservation of our food in the region. How do we revive those knowledge? Sustainable sea transportation that also allows reviving of traditional sailing methods. If we are looking at a just transition, what are already existing success stories or existing practices that our ancestors were using in the past and have sustained our environment for decades? How can we revive this learning? Being practical is also going to communities and being able to, instead of a top-down approach, but being able to sit with them, understanding their context and saying, look, how do we co-design this solution? We will, what's best for your community. We will, as our part is, we'll go and look for funding to facilitate this. An initiative of mangrove planting. Activism is really a unique project where young people go out and pick, rubbish that's washed off to our shores, and then create this into work of arts that's displayed. But also, we're able to call out companies or corporations like Coca-Cola, water bottles, like Fiji Water even, who are, not being responsible when they are in their own production. And of course, that is, whole part of the work that PCC does is, in a nutshell, to be prophetic, be providing pastoral care and support, and at the same time being practical, so that we're not just seen as being the, just advocating and talking loud out there, but at the same time, we're also acting through the work that we do with communities, member churches, and National Council of Churches. Why is it important, or why we do what we do? I guess we've heard a lot about loss and damage. Loss and damage really, if I was to put it in a more simplistic term, in a community that we work with would be the stories like, 10 years ago, our beachfront was further, was 20 meters further into the ocean. But now the water has come on to our foreshore, and it has covered this 20 meters of beachfront. Those are the stories, those are the common stories that you hear from communities living along the coastline. And we know through this work of on climate change, there are sudden onset and slow onset events that occur, and communities are exposed to these year in and year out. As we speak here in the Pacific, November is we're starting our cyclone season here in November. So while our representatives are at COP, at the back of their mind, apart from the discussions around climate change, we're approaching our disaster period. Therefore, if we do get, we've experienced this the past 10 years, a lot of the experience or a lot of the disasters that have been hit with has been stronger, or the strength has intensified over the past 5 years, and it has been frequent. For Fiji, at least in 2020, we had 3 cyclones. 2 were category 5 and 1 was category 3. So the devastation people go through or communities face is ongoing. While they're still recovering from one cyclone, another cyclone hits. And I've just, put together a couple of pictures there of some communities that were devastated in the last 3 years with the cyclones that have hit them. And a lot of these communities have invested in their homes, have invested in renewable energy, as you can see on the solar panel that's broken or damaged on the rooftop, a house, a family now living on tent, home, makeshift tent, and of course, a house here trying to rebuild back on after a cyclone. The roof of this house was blown out. So they are living on another. They built at least a temporary shelter at the moment before they rebuild back. So this is a common, when you talk about loss and damage, this is what we talk about, how communities are faced with these economic losses. They've invested so much in their communities, in their families, that when one cyclone comes, these are all destroyed. And you will notice here, this is a big deal, at least the discussions around loss and damage, because every day small island developing states are experiencing the direct, unavoidable losses and permanent damage arising from climate change. And in some cases, at least a lot of our governments have not I guess, financially prepared for this. And therefore, the cost of damages or cost of losses in a cyclone, at least, would come to millions or billions worth, this is related to the damages to homes, community infrastructures, even food and water sources, livelihoods, and to a point where, if we're linking the conversations around climate change that exacerbate disasters to the point that people do not feel safe anymore where they live. And for indigenous communities in the Pacific, this is quite sensitive when you're talking about having people to relocate to a safer zone because their home or their current location is no longer safe. Our context in the Pacific, and I guess with almost a lot of indigenous communities, is that we're an extension of our land and ocean. Our sacred totems gives us this identity that that describe who we are. And so when this is destroyed, when we see that our coastal lines have receded, our land is inundated, or there's saltwater intrusion, we can't plant our own food, and we are told to relocate, we are told to leave this place that we've called home, it becomes a conflicting issue, because why do we have to relocate when we are the least, when we are least emitters of carbon gases, yet we have to face this reality, to leave our homes, to relocate, to find another home, to find a new sets of livelihood, to start all over again. So that is a big challenge. So when we're talking about loss and damage, it also, at least in the relocation work we've done, how just is this work when the communities who are the least to contribute to carbon emission facilitates in financial terms their own relocation process. They feel like they need to contribute to this because it's necessary, it's important. Otherwise, there will be no one to support this community. So that's, the engagement on losses and damage, the engagement on either non-economic or economic losses and damage, it's quite critical in our conversation because it brings to the fore the conversation around climate financing. We can do as much as we can. The Pacific region, we will push back. We'll try as much as possible to advocate for 1.5 to stay alive because it's a negotiation for our survival. But at the same time, we need to support communities who are at the forefront, who are on a daily basis facing this reality of, impacts of climate change. How and where it is helpful to include gender-informed solution to climate action. I've briefly brought into this presentation how we work at the Pacific Conference of Churches. So we engage through our member churches to the communities, the displaced communities. We engage through the national governments, the provincial government, accompaniment, as I've mentioned earlier, but at the same time, try and bring back real voices, real stories back through our awareness, through our advocacy, not only to national governments, to provincial government, but also at regional platforms and of course through the World Council of Churches to other global platforms. And I think we're very fortunate to be working closely with Athena, the World Council of Churches, because it provides us this space to share our stories and also identifies ways that we can influence conversations around climate justice. And in all these spaces, I guess for the work that we do, it is important to engage women. It is important to bring the stories of women from the communities. And in the different levels of provincial, national governments, where are the women's, are we allowing, where are we pushing the women's stories right up to the negotiation level? And therefore, it's important that you identify, I guess for us, it's important to identify our partners or community of practice throughout these processes, because we will know the stories of women or the leadership of women in engaging, in finding solutions, in identifying projects will be highlighted at different level. And so for us, it's engaging with women where they are, going to communities and being able to talk about their issues, having a talanoa or an awareness session in a community hall and being able to talk to women in their own communities, having a small group at least, being able to separate the older women and the younger women so that we can, be able to identify what are the different issues that are coming from these different groups. But at the same time, we can also be very, being activists is being upfront. We know what we want. This is our message, 1.5 to stay alive. If we are not allowed in the room, how do we find our space to have our voice heard? If we're not invited into the space, we'll create that space. And of course, knowing or being able to identify spaces or platforms that we will push our women theologians, women leaders from the community, from the region to participate and talk about their stories in. So you'll see one of our theologians from Kiribati speaking to the Australian government, a young woman also, youth coordinator at the Pacific Conference of Churches, a young woman speaking at the nuclear treaty conference in Vienna early this year. So it's identifying the strength that women have and being able to support them to have this message carried forth right to those that negotiate. And finally, these are just some of the key asks that we have been following or we have been advocating on since April, since the CESW, Commission on the Status of Women in April of this year or March of this year. You all have heard the Vanuatu government being the first government that's called for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, a phase out, a phase down in coal, oil, and gas production. I guess that has been the language or the push from the Pacific, and we'll continue to call that out. The process, the conversation around loss and damage has been really slow. On a daily basis, we continue to see the impacts. Communities coming to not just the churches, civil society organizations, seeking support in trying to implement projects that will support or that will protect. They'll just give them enough time to make a decision whether they should relocate or not. That process or that discussion at the global level is very slow. How long, how much more time do we need to come up with a decision to fast track or to support the call for an end to a fossil fuel based economies. And of course, we can no longer deny the loss and damage that you have caused. Pay up. The financial institution or climate financing, how does it work? There's conversation around putting $100 billion US dollars into the facilities to support communities or to support countries that are on the forefront of climate change. But how much of that has been done? A lot of our governments are having to negotiate between grants and loan. When we are in the forefront of this and we are taking loan, our people are going to pay with interest the loan or the loan that governments would take. Therefore, we're calling for grants. We're calling for corporations who are emitting more carbon emitting more carbon gases to pay up, or governments, developing countries to pay up, not only to save the Pacific, but it's to save our planet, to save other species, and to save the rest of the world. And this, I want to conclude this, is a banner that I got from one of our member churches in Tonga. The young people put together this banner to as part of their eco school, rising seas. These are evidence of what they've experienced in Tonga: rising seas, dying coral, ocean acidification that's seen fish traveling to further colder waters or migrating to other waters, and therefore limiting their catch, at least in their own communities. And of course, forced displacement, because this is what we did not ask for this. And so the bottom line is, if we're able to save the Pacific, we're able to save the world. And of course, saving the world is being able to know that the future generation will be able to have the planet that they want. Everyone.
Thank you very much, Francis, for that powerful witness, and for sharing with us the specific challenges of the Pacific region, and also, some of the devastation that has occurred there, but then also the opportunities of engagement and very practical options on how to be prophetic, how to accompany with pastoral care, and then also how to be practical and have a toolkit for communities to learn about these issues and have a language. So thank you very much, Francis, for that witness and the work that you do. Now I would like to introduce Ms. Athena Peralta, Program Executive for Economic and Ecological Justice for the World Council of Churches. She's a former Senior Economic Development Specialist of the National Economic and Development Authority of the Philippines. And I've had the pleasure to know Athena for a number of years now, and she's been a wonderful mentor in environmental, economic, gender, justice issues, and just very appreciative of her work and her witness that she brings as well. So we're very happy to have you with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ilka, for this opportunity to share. And thank you also to Frances. Such a joy to hear the work, the incredible work that you and the Pacific Conference of Churches are doing. And yeah, it's great to be together with both Ilka and Frances in the same Zoom meeting. because these are two very powerful women. So such a privilege. So friends, I'm from the Philippines, and so this is also in the Pacific, I would say. So we also have a lot in common with what is happening in the Pacific region. But let me start with a story. Quite a few years back, I was engaged in a research project on gender and climate change finance in the Philippines. And as part of this research, I had the privilege of interviewing a group of women farmers, and these women farmers were from the National Federation of Women Farmers, which is called Amihan in the Filipino language. And one of the women farmers said something that really struck me. For them, of course, one of the main manifestations of climate change is altered rain patterns. And so the women said, you know, the seasons have become forgetful. In the dry season, it rains, and during the wet season, there is drought. And, you know, this for them is very much what climate change is about. And aside from the erratic monsoons, powerful typhoons, I mean, someone already in the chat pointed out that the Philippines is visited by around, on average, 20 typhoons a year. And so erratic monsoons, plus we have these more frequent and more intense typhoons, which are disrupting planting seasons, and not just disrupting planting seasons, but also really, destroying crop yields with devastating consequences for livelihoods. In the Philippines, women farmers would comprise around 70% of paid and unpaid agricultural labor, particularly in rice and corn. And these women would often be small owner cultivators, or they would be tenants or farm workers. And they would have the primary tasks of planting, of weeding, harvesting, sacking, and storing seeds. On the other hand, men are usually responsible for preparing the land, applying fertilizers and pesticides. And so these are the tasks that usually are mechanized, or involve some technology or some machines. So while we were talking with the women farmers in Amihan about how climate change is affecting them, they shared that women are affected disproportionately in at least 3 ways. First of all, when harvests collapse, either because of floods or because of droughts, they find it harder to cope because they have fewer assets, such as land, to sell. And linked to this, more women than men fall into indebtedness related to crop failures, in part because microcredit schemes are usually targeted at women, but also because women are seen to be managers of the production and household expenses, and so they are under stronger pressure to bridge resource gaps. And so there was a study, for instance, showing that almost 94% of women involved in rice production in the Philippines had to borrow money from informal money lenders, cooperatives, relatives, etc., both to finance rice cultivation as well as to augment household expenditures. And third, when food shortages actually arise because of the poor harvests, women will tend to prioritize the food needs of their children and of male household members over their own. So it is against this background that I also reflect on COP27, which is currently underway, on the question of why feminist leadership and why gender justice are crucial for building solutions to the climate crisis. And as a first step, we need to interrogate power relations in the context of climate change. Some feminist scholars have argued that the climate crisis is also linked to, or also emerges out of, this human drive for conquest, power, and dominion. And some feminist scholars have argued that it's not just a human drive, but it's also a very, very masculine drive for conquest, power, and dominion over our planet and over the natural resources that provide our basic needs, such as water, food, and shelter, and so on. So obviously, climate change is an environmental phenomenon, but it has really profound socioeconomic impacts, which are shaped by these unequal power relations. There is clearly a huge power imbalance between global north and global south, and Frances has also pointed to this. At the same time, power in society, both in poorer and richer countries, is also unequally and unjustly tilted in favor of men, making women more vulnerable to climate change than men. As mentioned, this is because women tend to have less economic power. They tend to have unequal access to finance. They tend to have limited control and ownership of land. And all of that means that women have less resources to fall back on and are less able to recover from these massive climate-induced natural disasters. In the Philippine case, I also found that climate finance, tended to be directed towards these big, flashy, renewable energy, transportation, and infrastructure projects to mitigate climate change. So these big, big projects involving businesses and private sector. In contrast, substantially less money was going into community-based projects to adapt to climate change. And these were usually, less money was going into agriculture and forestry adaptation projects, for instance. And these are the projects that tend to, protect livelihoods more, but less money is going into those types of projects. So aside from the fact that women have less economic power, women also have less political power. And especially so if they are coming from marginalized groups. And so they are very much often excluded from the decision and policy-making forums, including within the climate change negotiations at the global level or in the COPs. So at the COPs, even with a range of efforts and initiatives, such as there's this gender action plan within the COPs, but in spite of this, women occupied only a third of all leadership positions in climate change negotiations and other so-called expert mechanisms from 2019 to 2021. And one consequence is that women's unique insights, which arise from their roles, for instance, as subsistence farmers, or their roles as caregivers in their family, don't figure much in developing policy. And indeed, this could be one of the reasons behind the bias, which I mentioned earlier, the bias towards these large-scale, market-oriented and technology-driven approaches to solving climate change, instead of more community rooted and so-called nature-based solutions to climate change. And feminist engagement is important for climate justice, and several studies are actually really bearing this out. We have studies that are revealing that when women have better representation in business and government, ecological issues are also better represented. In business, for instance, when we have more women in business, there tends to be greater transparency when it comes to reporting on corporate carbon emissions, for instance. We have also studies showing that when we have more women in parliament, this tends to result in the ratification of more international environmental treaties, as well as tougher policies on climate change and environment in general. And we also have studies showing that countries where women are respected, where women hold more political power, these countries also tend to have smaller carbon footprints. At the more local level, when women are involved in managing natural resources, there tends to be better governance and stronger conservation outcomes. At the same time, again, research is also saying that when you strengthen feminist leadership, this helps to deliver or to generate more equitable results. That the climate solutions, usually don't come if you strengthen feminist leadership. The climate solutions don't come at the expense of livelihoods. And some research is suggesting that this could be because women tend to assess risk differently, that perhaps they tend to prioritize the well-being of their communities and their families when it comes to managing resources compared to men. Maybe also because since women tend to be responsible for the vast majority of unpaid domestic and care work, such as collecting water, preparing food, taking care of the children and the elderly. Perhaps because of this, women are also better attuned to the impacts of climate change in everyday life, in everyday activities. So now we come to the COP. And I was in Sharm el-Sheikh all of last week until Sunday evening. And the COPs are, I've attended quite a few COPs, and I always come out somewhat depressed. It's because our governments are always painfully slow to act, painfully short-sighted. And unfortunately, we have very rich and very powerful countries that are derailing concrete and adequate action, as Francis was also pointing out, particularly when it comes to climate finance, as well as loss and damage within the UN climate negotiations. And part of this is because we have powerful fossil fuel companies and other big businesses that are lobbying against the necessary changes in our economic system that are urgently needed if we are to meet the Paris goal of keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is, of course, the safe limit, relatively safe limit. And in COP27, we heard that there's actually been a 25% increase in fossil fuel lobbyists. So that's not a good sign. So what is clear is that courageous and sustained engagement with these dominant powers is essential if we are going to secure deep-seated changes and a chance for our children to have a livable future. And the good news is that feminist leaders have been boldly speaking truth to power and holding their own governments or G20 governments and corporations to account. Perhaps my favorite example would be Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados. She spoke at COP27 as well, but I have this quote from her from COP26, where she told wealthy governments that failure to provide funding to small island nations on the front line of climate change is, and I quote, measured in lives and livelihoods. And she also said, and I quote, this is immoral and it is unjust. Her government, the government of Barbados, has also come up with concrete and out-of-the-box proposals for financing climate mitigation and adaptation. So she's really one of the feminist leaders. I think that we are, that's inspiring. But we also have many examples from the community level, you know, so, and I go back to the women farmers of Amihan, and they have been tirelessly calling upon the Philippine government for genuine land reform so that they may be able to own the land they till. And they have also been tirelessly calling for support for climate change adaptation. But even as we celebrate Mia, even as we celebrate other, you know, the women of Amihan, we also have to remember that speaking truth to power can also be very dangerous in some contexts. And we have women climate and environmental defenders in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America who have been threatened, incarcerated, and even murdered for their work and advocacy. And we remember, for instance, Berta Caceres, an indigenous leader in Honduras, who was murdered in 2016 for fighting against the Aguasarca Dam, and many more like her. So I'm about to wrap up. I would say that a truly feminist perspective seeks to overcome silos, seeks to address intersections, and has as goals the transformation of power structures and the equitable redistribution of resources. In other words, you know, system change. And if these goals are going to be realized, then power must move away from, you know, big polluters and from the wealthy who have very much benefited from the status quo towards those who are most affected by a warming climate, such as women, such as youth and indigenous peoples. Power must move away to those who are seeking building and already practicing just and sustainable economies. And as mentioned, many such economies are spearheaded by women, rural women, and indigenous women. Again, the women farmers of Amihan who are establishing agroecology cooperatives, both in response to the pandemic and to climate change. We have indigenous women who are safeguarding forests, regenerating soils and ecosystems, using their own indigenous wisdom and practices. So these are very concrete and practical examples. Having said all of that, what does this mean for COP27? What would be our calls to COP27 with a gender lens? And Frances already started out by saying, you know, that we really have to, you know, make good on this 1.5 to stay alive kind of. This is kind of like the essence of the call from the Pacific. And this is about really ramping up nationally determined contributions. And this means that especially those countries that are historically responsible for climate change and who have greater financial and technological capacities, these are the governments that must especially ramp up their NDCs in order to meet the 1.5 Celsius goal. And as Frances has said, this also means, you know, putting, halting any fossil fuel expansion as part of the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that Frances was also talking about. But this is also about implementing a just transition to a post-fossil fuel and post-growth economy. And for this transition has to be gender just. And for this transition to be gender just, we need to incorporate gender responsive public services, universal social protection, health care systems, measures that encourage the development of a care economy, and measures that prevent violence against women and girls in climate policies and actions. This also means, again, looking at our key calls, climate finance. Climate finance must be gender responsive. We heard from Frances talking about the $100 billion climate finance goal, a promise that wealthy and industrialized countries have yet to make good on up to now. This is critical for supporting vulnerable countries in pursuing, you know, their action plans for the protection of people. It's critical that this finance reach communities, women and girls, and that, you know, this finance should not be going into, you know, just large scale, big infrastructure projects, but really reach the communities, women and girls. And again, Frances spoke a lot about loss and damage, and loss and damage must account for women's experiences. At this COP, faith-based organizations and civil society have been calling for a loss and damage funding facility. And this must be grants-based, as Frances has also pointed out. And this is important for compensating communities on the front line of climate impacts. And this is important so that women and girls can actually rebuild and recover in the face of the losses and damages caused by climate change. So we have only one common home, and it is in peril as this climate crisis continues to deepen. And we are in this crisis together. And so it's only together and with power sharing and collective action can we swing the pendulum towards a more just and sustainable and caring planet. And I end here. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Athena. And thank you for reminding us that what we need is system change and really a commitment to work together for loss and damage and to create a more just systems, not only phasing out of fossil fuels, which Women in Faith is also a signer of that non-proliferation treaty, fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, but then also building that just transition where we need more women in leadership, women being educated and making sure we're building those skills in those communities. And I also appreciated the very concrete examples of some of those communities, and the example of Barbados and the small farmers as well, and their specific examples, but then and struggles that they face with recognition in development policies, but then also some of the innovative thinking that is coming out of that, so, such as the out-of-the-box funding and schemes that are coming out of that, as well from the loss and damage fund that has been proposed this week here at COP, trying to bring some of that support to those issues. And so with that being said, I want us to think of some of the questions that we have for our speakers, and you can write them on the chat, or please feel free to unmute yourselves. Either you have a question for Athena or Francis, please feel free to write those forward, and we'll be reading those over. And also, if you have words of appreciation, we're very much welcoming those as well. So thank you. And I see some comments on the chat, so I'll be sharing some of those of appreciation. I think they really liked some of the gender analysis. Elizabeth Liz is sharing. Thank you, Francis and Athena, for this informative presentations of context and what needs to happen next, and the gender analysis you have provided, and appreciative of the work that you're doing. Ms. Emma is asking if we can have the graphic up again to be read. And I don't know if it will be possible to share perhaps some of the presentation that you share with us, Ms. Francis. I'm sure our members would love to read that more closely as well, if there's a chance to do that. Well, and as some people are thinking of questions, I do have a couple of questions of my own, so I'll perhaps give a little bit more time. But I was wondering, some of our members were talking about why is it important to use this feminist approach and analysis to the issues and the climate crisis. What are the insights that utilizing a feminist approach or analysis can give us to really make sense of some of the disproportionate challenges that we're seeing communities facing? I don't know if Athena, you would like to speak a little bit on that, or
yeah, thanks for that question. And I guess there's several reasons why a feminist analysis is critical. I mean, of course, we know that women are disproportionately affected, but I think in terms of the solutions, it's also really important to have this gender analysis in terms of a strategy as well. Feminist analysis, as I mentioned in my presentation, we really bring a very strong power analysis. And this is key in the climate change negotiations. Whereas it's the climate change negotiations is clearly all about power it's the areas where a lot of money is involved. Those are the areas which are not moving at all. And so our gender analysis brings this power analysis, and recognizing that we have to interrogate and confront power at these different levels. Helps us also to sharpen our strategy for the way forward. But the other reason why it's important is because women are responsible very much for what we call the care economy. And right now in the climate change negotiations, everyone's just looking so focused on the impact of climate change, perhaps on their or the impact the impact of climate change on their economies, or the impact of climate actions on their formal economies, meaning the market economy, but not so much looking or completely ignoring, I would say, the impact on the care economy. But the care economy is basically what is also supporting the more formal economy, because this is this is about taking care of the kids, making cooking the food. So these are very this is about managing food and water. So it's basic stuff. It's as well. It's and so I think a gender analysis, recognizes first that care work is important, but also I think prioritizes care of community, families, and livelihoods. And I think that is also very key to when it comes to kind of developing as well policies as well as practical solutions. So it's, I think, not surprising that women are in the forefront of nature-based solutions, for instance, to climate change, such as agroforestry and land regeneration techniques, and many of these solutions as well are very much rooted on indigenous knowledge.
Thank you very much, Athena. And Ruth, would you like to ask a question? I've seen on the chat.
Okay, what seems to be missing from the conversations now, of course, I'm not at COP27, obviously, but what seems to be missing from conversations, and why a lot of people in my personal interactions don't want to, choose not to get, is the impact right here and now climate change is having on the health and well-being of pregnant women, of children. Therefore, if they can be, this is what's happening now because of this. So if we do these solutions, this is what can happen. This will be the outcome. There's got to be a connection that people can see and almost feel between what's happening now to their health and well-being and what these solutions can do to help that, to mitigate that. You see what I'm saying? That's what's missing from a lot of conversations. And so I don't know if that's even having, at the COP27 anywhere, but locally, people want to know, okay, this is happening to me. What is your solution going to do to help me right here with this health issue? And pregnant women in a lot of communities are horribly impacted by the pollution and other issues. So you see what I'm getting at? There needs to be a connection people can see and feel.
I appreciate that question, Ruth. And I don't know if Frances, you would like to address.
Thank you. Thank you, Ruth. I think that's probably why we often bring the stories of communities, women in these spaces. There is a disconnection between, what's happening at the negotiation level and the reality at the community level. I guess our role really is to bridge if we're working with communities, how do you see your issue in the conversation? How do we link, if it's the health issue, how do you link that to the conversation of adaptation, of mitigation, of climate financing? When it comes to climate financing, how does the finance meet the, the processes that you'll be able to be facilitated when you, when it comes to your health issues? So it's being able to link, the realities of women at the community level and the negotiation. I guess that's probably where some of our organizations come in to make that linkage. And even to bring the communities themselves. I guess from the Pacific, we've often tried to bring reps from the communities who will be able to talk in these spaces. And sometimes I guess the language is a barrier, when it comes to our stories. The political language, technical terms that happens at the negotiation level does not really take into account some of our, everyday stories. I guess that's probably why the role that we play is important, because when we find ourselves sitting in these different spaces, how do we then push this information through? But at the same time, knowing that at the end of the day, whatever the feedback, we're also monitoring how will this impact the communities that we serve again. I'm not sure if, Athena, if you want to add on.
I think that was a really good response, and very much something that we've been seeing here and calling for as well. I want to take us to our next question and last question from Pam, and that's for Athena. For a grassroots small meeting to discuss climate change impact with city governments, what major issues should be discussed? And I think this is important because we're talking about bringing this large global agenda home. So what would be the topics to discuss? Should we identify amount of fossil fuels used by the city infrastructure?
Thank you for that question. And also just to say that perhaps Frances might also want to say something to this, just to also say that, of course, my experience is more at the global level, which is also why I hope that Frances can weigh in on this question, as I think she might be able to also contribute very much. But I think that this is important indeed. This, of course, very much depends on which community, which city government you're talking with. But I'm assuming that, of course, this is perhaps a city government in the United States, and of course, many of us in civil society and faith-based organizations have been calling upon basically big emitters and polluters, such as the US, to really ramp up their commitments to reduce and cut their greenhouse gas emissions. And it's very slow, as mentioned, at the global level. But we have also seen some cities coming out and saying, okay, if our government is not committing nationally, some cities are actually coming out and saying we're going to do what we can. And so I think there is indeed potential in talking with your city governments to also try to, commit, maybe do more than commit, but as a starting point, at least, to commit to becoming carbon neutral by 2050, and then to discuss at that level, how can we become carbon neutral by 2050 and ideally earlier. And that means, also the other goal is actually to halve emissions by 2030, and that's like in less than 10 years. And again, it would be how to do this will depend very much on your city. But I think that's that it would be indeed very helpful for people, communities of faith, to be engaging their city governments on this. It's in some ways it's also about using your socioeconomic privilege to be able to push your own city governments to do everything they can to really cut their greenhouse gas emissions. And I think at that level, that would be the best way. At the national level, I mean, we have other calls, related to providing climate finance and so on. But I think at the city government level, this is what you've indicated is indeed very important. And I hope Francis can can also weigh in.
Do you want to share a sentence? We have like 1 minute left. But
yeah, maybe just adding on in the discussion of phasing out, what other alternative is there that you can already look to, so that it's not, it's a just transition as well for everyone. So while discussing the option in phasing out, I think that's one area, at least here in the Pacific, we're looking at traditional voyaging as an alternative, because we live in a lot of our communities are in maritime islands, and therefore going from one island to another island is using a fiber boat, fossil fuel. So it's the alternative, having a traditional, going back to our traditional sailing canoes. Is this workable? And I guess what Athena said is important. Having our city governments agreeing, making that commitment, and then we take a step, one step at a time. But showing that commitment is one way to go, to start off, bringing people to identify what can we do together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis. I think that's a great way of closing us in. So very appreciative of your support. So I'm gonna share real quick, just for a matter of time. I'm gonna go a little bit quick through our action steps, because we want to make sure we're putting in practice what we're learning. And so we share here, Francis, your asks. Real quick, the privilege this hopefully will be getting through the presentation, but continuing to ask for organizations and the institutions that we're part of to sign and call for non-proliferation of fossil fuels. That continues to be very important, because we don't want to expand and put money that we're funding crises. We should be funding solutions, not crises. And so this is very important. We have our own, also in the next slide, our own climate justice campaign, continuing to urge Congress to prioritize climate justice legislation fund. As we know, with the passing of the IRA, there's continued funding that has been approved by the administration, and so holding local governments accountable to access those funds and implement them in a just manner, it's a matter that we have to take in hand. And so continuing to channel support for that campaign is very important, and we'll be sharing the links at the end. Next, we have our postcards that you can send in the next slide to Congress and governors to invest in electric vehicles, especially school buses. There's increased funding for that. We've been asking members and continue to encourage you to send your postcards. People love to receive members of Congress and governors love to hear from you and get your letters. So you can print this and send them over. And we want to protect the health of our children, something that we've been talking about and Ruth mentioned, right? And so this is one very specific thing that we can ask for and connect with climate change. Next, we have our next working group will be on December 6th at the same time as usual at 7 p.m. And that will be our last working group for the year. And we'll be discussing more a little bit of this conversation that we just had on gender and global south perspectives on COP27, but also at large in the work for climate justice. Next, we will have our monthly webinar. We would not have a December webinar, but we'll be restarting our program on January 18th. So please stay in tune and check your email for receiving an invitation. And for the new folks that have joined us for this call for the first time, feel free to sign online at United Women in Faith, serve and advocate under our campaign for Just Energy for All, and you can receive updates if you want to continue getting in touch with us. Next, we would have continuing programming for COP27 as well. And so we have a section called United Women in Faith brings COP27 to your home, and you can have some of the latest information and events there, including our event tomorrow with the other United Methodist Church agencies, and we will talk about different perspectives and goals from the UN climate talk. So that will be tomorrow. And you can find more information also on the link that we'll be pasting in the chat here shortly. And lastly, I would like you to sign up our evaluation as normal to hear more from you and some of the topics also that you would like to discuss for next year. So we can move a couple of slides over and have Ruth close us in prayer.
Can everybody hear me? I hope so. Okay, cool. Let us pray. Creator God, thank you for your divine creation. We honor you when we are the committed, honest, faithful, and compassionate stewards you need and want us to be. Help us to frame our world so that our eyes, ears, hearts, and minds are always open to the work that you are doing in and around us throughout your world, noticing when you show up in our lives and in the lives of others and in all of creation. Open our eyes, ears, and hearts and minds to the voices from around the world, and help us to remember that we must be active participants in the work that you want us to do and that you are doing. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Ruth, for that beautiful prayer. And thank you, everyone, for joining us again for Just Energy for All webinar, the last of our series. Thank you all for the ones that have continued to join our program throughout the year, and please stay tuned for the next year. And thank you so much for our speakers that have brought such amazing witness from their work to this conversation. And I hope that can continue to inspire us for the work moving forward. And wishing you all wonderful holidays with your families, and hopefully we can continue these conversations and keep in mind from these voices that we have heard today and continue moving the conversation and the work forward.